In the summer of 1977, Alaska was as vast as ever, so vast that one felt like a tiny visitor, entering and leaving nothing behind but a few faint footprints on the damp earth. The afternoons stretched on endlessly, sunlight slanting through the spruce forests, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of resin and cold ice. Here, the silence wasn't frightening. It was familiar, gentle, a part of life itself. The people of Alaska grew up with that silence. They believe in this land not because it is safe, but because they understand it. When someone goes into the woods, people know they will return, perhaps later than expected, perhaps tired, but they will return. That is a belief built over generations through thousands of journeys and returns. But that summer, there was a place where the silence was unlike anything before. A narrow, little-known trail nestled between the forest and the mountainside. No warning signs, no cautionary tales. Just the feeling that everything was normal until one began to wait, waiting for a husband, waiting for a child, waiting for a friend. And then realizing that the most terrifying thing wasn't the sounds in the forest, but the forest being too silent for too long. Raven's Pass was never really considered a place to visit. It wasn't a stopover, a campsite, or a place where people sought anything special. To Alaskans, Raven's Pass was simply a crossing, a link between river systems and valleys, shortening the journey through the vast Talkeetna Hills. This trail is narrow, winding through spruce forests and low rocky slopes. It's not beautiful enough to make people stop for photos, nor is it treacherous enough to deter even experienced hikers. Park rangers describe Raven's Pass as difficult but manageable, a trail that demands attention, not courage. In the summer, footprints overlapped each other. Hunters, surveyors, seasonal workers, they all walked through here. They didn't tell stories about Raven's Pass because there was nothing to tell. It was like a familiar corridor in the large house called Alaska. You walked in, passed through, and left. No one stayed in the corridor. Therefore, no one thought this place could hold humans. Raven's Pass didn't look dangerous. It looked ordinary. And sometimes, that very ordinariness is the most terrifying disguise. Daniel Kroger entered Raven's Pass in early June 1977, like so many other mornings in his life. 34 years old, a local surveyor, Daniel was accustomed to working alone in the wilderness. He wasn't a thrill seeker. He was the kind of person who believed in maps, in data, in what could be measured by experience and discipline. Daniel understood Alaska in a very practical way. He knew where the danger lay and where caution was needed. He had traversed the wilderness far more remote than Raven's Pass many times, returning with mud-stained clothes and worn-out shoes, but always returning. For Daniel, the forest wasn't a mystery. It was his workplace. That morning, he packed light. Enough food for 3 days, measuring instruments, the compass that had been with him for years. Before leaving, Daniel left a message for his wife, Linda, saying he would be back before the weekend was over. A very ordinary message, like dozens of times before. No anxiety, no premonition. As Sunday night passed and Daniel still hadn't returned, Linda didn't panic. In Alaska, delays were commonplace. The weather could change. The trails could flood. Even experienced travelers sometimes had to wait. But by Tuesday morning, the prolonged silence began to take on a different feel. Not noisy, not violent. Just the feeling that a man who had no reason to disappear had truly not returned. The search for Daniel Kroger began in the familiar calm of Alaska. No sirens, no panic. Just a procedure repeated many times when someone is delayed longer than usual. Rangers proceeded to the western entrance of Raven's Pass, where Daniel was presumed to have entered. They quickly found his footprints. Clear, regular, familiar. The shoe prints on the damp ground were like hundreds of others that had walked this path before. Everything was still so normal. Daniel was here. Daniel was going in the right direction. But after just over 2 miles, that ordinariness ended. Footprints faded and then disappeared completely. No backpacks were left behind, no tools were dropped, there were no signs of slips or struggles, just an empty space where a person's journey came to a halt without explanation. The rangers lingered longer than necessary. They looked around, turning over every small rock, searching for some familiar detail. But the forest offered no answer. After 3 days, the search narrowed. The record noted the possibility of environmental exposure, a neat procedural conclusion. Only those who had stayed the longest along that stretch of road understood that something didn't fit. Not because they found too little, but because they found nothing at all. 2 weeks after Daniel Kroger disappeared, Ravens Pass welcomed another person, Martha Ellison, 29, a graduate student from Fairbanks. She wasn't a reckless person. Martha chose the forest because of her love for wildlife, for the quiet moments where humans could simply observe without interfering. Martha had worked in Denali before. She understood what isolation meant, what it meant to take responsibility for every step she took. Before entering Ravens Pass, she registered her route with the park rangers, specifying her planned departure date and a meeting point with a friend to the east. She carried a camera that weighed more than her food, but everything was carefully planned. When Martha didn't show up at the meeting point on the scheduled day, her friend informed her. This time, the rangers paid more attention, though they still called it a coincidence. The search proceeded more quickly, and by the 3rd day, they found Martha's camp. Everything there made one pause for a long time. The tent was still firmly pitched. The sleeping bag was half rolled up, as if its owner had only just gotten up a moment ago. The shoes were neatly placed in front of the tent entrance. The backpack, food, and emergency supplies were still there. There were no signs of anyone leaving the camp, no signs of panic. A ranger later said that Martha's camp didn't look abandoned. It was more like a scene paused midway, as if she thought she'd be back very quickly, but Martha Ellison never returned. And the silence around that tent weighed more heavily than any storm that had ever passed through Ravens Pass. In late June, Thomas Hale entered Ravens Pass in a very different way. Tom, 41, was a seasoned off-road pilot accustomed to the risks of flying. He had landed on frozen lakes, navigated narrow gravel paths, where a single misstep meant no second chance. For Tom, danger wasn't an abstraction. It was part of the daily routine. Tom wasn't walking for relaxation. He was surveying fishing spots to fly passengers later in the summer. Before leaving, he notified air traffic control, leaving his coordinates with a colleague. His route only briefly crossed Ravens Pass, as a shortcut to save time and fuel. A practical decision, familiar to someone in the aviation profession. When Tom's plane lay motionless on the gravel for days, the other pilots suspected a technical malfunction. 5 days passed before the search began. And then, what they found left even the most seasoned pilots speechless. Tom's gun leaned against a tree trunk right next to the trail. His backpack lay nearby, unlocked, his food untouched. No blood, no tears, no disturbed soil, no signs of falls or panic. It was as if Tom, in the midst of a perfectly normal walk, had decided he didn't need to carry anything anymore. To those who knew Tom, it was impossible. A pilot accustomed to facing risks would never stray from his survival tool. Tom Hale's disappearance was not only illogical. It left Ravens Pass no longer a path, but a heavy question mark hanging in the silence. Eli Nakamura arrived in Alaska that spring, just as the snow was receding from the mountain slopes and trails were beginning to appear. 22 years old, a seasonal forestry worker, Eli carried with him the youthful eagerness of someone experiencing the vastness of the land for the first time. He wasn't seeking mystery. He simply wanted to complete his long journey before returning south. Before entering Ravens Pass, Eli stopped at the ranger station. He asked the same old questions. What was the water level? Was the trail safe? He borrowed an old map, folded it carefully, and left. No one watched him go for long. Faces like Eli's appeared and disappeared each season, often in a very ordinary way. When Eli failed to arrive at the eastern station to report the end of his journey, no alarm sounded. It wasn't until nearly a week later that his absence was noticed, hidden among the paperwork and lists. By then, everything had cooled down. There was no camp to search, no belongings to trace, just a name added to the record. Eli's disappearance caused no shock. It was quiet, flowing through the system as if it had never existed. And it was that very silence that made Raven's Pass even more terrifying, not just because it held people captive, but because sometimes no one even realizes they've lost someone. When the records are placed side by side, Raven's Pass is no longer a collection of disjointed stories. The names, the dates, the discarded items begin to form a cold, unwavering line. 4 different groups, 13 people. Ages, occupations, experiences vary. Reasons for entering the woods differ, but they all lead to the same place. It was a stretch of road, about 11 miles long, located near the center of Raven's Pass. Not the highest point, not near a river, not the most dangerous place on the map. Just a perfectly ordinary stretch of forest and hillside. It was precisely that ordinariness that made the searchers uneasy. Rescue teams were expanded. Helicopters flew low over the treetops. Search dogs were brought in from Anchorage. Volunteers walked in rows, meticulously searching every meter of land. And each time, the scent led them to the same area, then stopped abruptly. No disorientation, no fading, just an end. The abandoned camps were eerily similar. Fires were lit and then left to die out. Water was boiled but not poured. Clocks stopped at noon. Each detail was small, but when layered, they formed an unmissable pattern. At that point, Raven's Pass ceased to be a place where people got lost. It became a place where their journeys were interrupted. And for the families waiting, the most painful thing wasn't the loss, but the feeling that something had happened in the same place, repeatedly, and no one was able to stop it. In the weeks that followed, familiar explanations were offered, then dismissed one by one. In Alaska, when humans disappear, nature is always the first name that comes to mind. Bears, landslides, changing weather, frost exposure. But at Raven's Pass, none of the theories lasted long enough to convince those who remained at the scene. Wildlife experts were called in. They looked at the undisturbed tracks, the untorn pieces of cloth, the intact campsites. There were no signs of hunting, no drag marks. There was no way a large animal could have carried humans away without leaving anything behind. The weather records were reviewed daily. No sudden storms, no unusual temperature drops. Those afternoons, according to the paperwork, were calm. Even exposure, the silent killer of the North, didn't fit. The cold-blooded people didn't take off their shoes. They didn't leave their food. They didn't leave the camp in such an orderly fashion. The rangers became quieter during their meetings. No one spoke, but everyone felt the same thing. When all traces of nature were absent, that absence itself became the clue. Raven's Pass didn't resemble a place where humanity had been defeated by nature. It resembled a place where nature had been pushed aside, making way for a more difficult, heavier question. If not the forest, then what? When the files were read through for the 3rd and 4th time, a small detail began to emerge, so small that at first no one noticed. Time. Not the day, not the month, but the hour. The last dates for each person all fell in the afternoon. Not much variation, not random. The clock found in Martha's camp stopped as the sun began to set. Tom's flight log recorded the last contact in the early afternoon. The disjointed notes concerning Daniel all ended after noon. Each instance, taken individually, was unremarkable, but when placed side by side, they formed a cold, straight line, stretching across different days at the same time of day. The Alaskan afternoon is when the forest is quietest. The wind weakens. The light softens. People often take advantage of the extra miles before setting up camp. It's the moment when people are most likely to let their guard down, thinking they've gone far enough to be safe. The investigators lingered on that detail longer than they wanted to admit, because if time repeated itself, the disappearance was no longer random. It was like a door that only opened for a short time each day. And someone, somehow, walked through that door at precisely the right moment, only to never return. The turning point didn't come from the forest, but from the paperwork. When investigators reopened aerial photographs from years ago, they weren't looking for anything strange. They just wanted to make sure they hadn't missed anything too obvious, and it was that obviousness that silenced the room. Near the 11th mile mark of Raven's Pass, amidst seemingly continuous patches of forest, a rectangular clearing appeared, too straight, too regular. Not like a landslide, not like a natural clearing, a trace of human hands. Old records indicate it was once a seismic station from the Cold War era, set up to listen for vibrations deep underground. According to the paperwork, the station was dismantled and closed in the late 60s. But reports end abruptly. There are no detailed descriptions of the dismantling. No one is sure what was taken away and what remains. From Raven's Pass, a dimly lit path veers into the woods. It's narrow, overgrown with trees, and looks like a continuation of the main road. To someone tired, in a hurry, or trusting a map, it's just a harmless turn. Investigators began to look at things differently. If something existed beyond the map, then those who entered Raven's Pass hadn't just gotten lost. They might have been on the right path, judging by what their eyes saw. And somewhere beyond that turn, part of the story had been so well concealed that, for years, no one knew it ever existed. The call came on a quiet evening, unannounced, without a number. The man's voice on the other end was low and weary, as if he had carried a heavy burden for too long. He didn't ask for anything. He only asked, very softly, if anyone else was listening. Then he said his name, Jonah Pike. Jonah said he had worked near Raven's Pass during the years people disappeared. Not a park ranger, not the military. A private contractor, familiar with short-term contracts and things that weren't recorded in reports. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully, as if each sentence came at a price. When asked who he had worked for, Jonah fell silent. He repeated that it wasn't information he was allowed to give away. But what Jonah described was specific enough to send chills down the spine. The side entrances, the maintenance schedule, the testing sessions often taking place in the afternoon. Symptoms that someone uninformed wouldn't understand. Dizziness, nausea, disorientation, a feeling of pressure on the body, as if the ground were breathing. When asked if those tests coincided with the dates of the disappearance, Jonah paused for a long time. He neither confirmed nor denied it. He simply said that the records existed and had never been handed over to civilian authorities. His voice was no longer calm. It carried the weariness of someone who had lived for years with something they couldn't say. Jonah agreed to meet once, without recording, without paperwork. He arrived late, looked around constantly, double-checking every detail he had said, then left as if he had never been there. Then Jonah Pike vanished from all contact. No explanation, no trace. Leaving only the feeling that the truth about Raven's Pass didn't come from the forest, but from people who had learned to be silent and paid the price for that silence their entire lives. Spring in 1985 arrived late in the Talkeetna Hills. The snow melted slowly, the water rose, and the ground softened in a way that made the locals understand that everything could change overnight. The seemingly immovable hillsides began to slide, silently but relentlessly, and it was in such a movement that the earth opened its mouth. A small landslide occurred less than 2 miles from Raven's Pass. At first, it looked like any other. Trees had fallen, mud ripped through the hillside, but amidst the rubble, an infrastructure inspector noticed something unnatural. A straight, cold metal edge protruded from the earth and rocks. When the earth was cleared away, an old service ditch, long buried, was revealed. No signs, no markings, just a narrow gap, running parallel to the hillside, as if it had been created to remain unseen. Inside that ditch, they found human remains. Not one. Daniel Kroger, Eli Nakamura, and Susan Fielding, who had vanished silently years earlier, almost forgotten amidst records that were never reopened. 3 people, 3 stories, finally lying side by side in a place not marked on any map. The autopsy revealed no signs of violence, no broken bones, no wounds. But it wasn't an instantaneous death either. Experts realized they had lived for several days after disappearing. They had moved. They had tried to orient themselves. They had hoped. Daniel's compass showed signs of multiple adjustments. Eli's notebook contained disjointed notes about the terrain that didn't match the map. In Susan's camera bag, undeveloped film rolls later revealed unfamiliar forests with no trails leading to them. They didn't die where they entered. They were taken away, not by blatant violence, but by a cold separation from familiar paths. The land didn't just return what it had kept. It forced the survivors to confront a heavier truth. Raven's Pass was never just a place where people disappeared. It was a place where they were cast out of their familiar world and left to fend for themselves in silence. Following the 1985 discovery, many believed that the truth would eventually come to light, that there would be hearings, accountability, and a moment of justice. But Raven's Pass did not follow that path. It veered in a different direction, more quietly and coldly. The meetings took place behind closed doors. No cameras, no public minutes. What was said wasn't about who was right or wrong, but about how to put an end to it. Files were reclassified. The language was carefully chosen, vague enough not to deny the truth, but also not to admit responsibility. The victims' families were contacted separately, not at the same time, not in the same way. Linda Kroger was informed that her husband had been found, that he had lived longer than previously thought, and that the cause of death was still listed as environmental. This came with a deal. The money wasn't large, but it came with the condition of silence. Eli Nakamura's family received a similar explanation, gentle, dry, like a formality to be completed. Susan Fielding was only mentioned briefly. Her name was returned to the file, then quickly included in the overall conclusion. No one was prosecuted. No trial was held. Everything ended with signatures on paper and handshakes that avoided eye contact. For some families, it was the only way to have something to bury, to close years of waiting. For others, it was the moment they understood that justice, in the public sense, was never an option. Raven's Pass was not resolved by truth spoken, but by truth kept hidden, neatly, legally, and forever, without anyone having to answer publicly. Today, looking back at Raven's Pass, it's still referred to as a closed trail for safety reasons. On new maps, it's just a faint mark, a void discouraged from passing. But for those who have followed the story from the beginning, Raven's Pass was never just a road. It's a boundary, not a boundary between safety and danger, but between what is allowed to be seen and what must be hidden. A seemingly ordinary corridor, existing to lead people across, without realizing they are very close to something not meant for them. Those who disappeared did not disappear because they were weak, nor because nature was angry. They were ordinary people, with families, plans to return, and the belief that the road ahead was just a path they had to traverse. When they mistakenly crossed that boundary, their existence became a problem to be solved, not a life to be protected. Raven's Pass reminds us that not all mysteries are born from chaos. Some mysteries are built on order, on process, on decisions made in silence. And sometimes, the most terrifying thing is not the wilderness devouring humanity, but the moment humanity decides to let the wilderness conceal them.